In 1969, the American space mission Apollo 11 landed on the moon and put humans on the moon for the first time. Yeah! Apollo 11! Woo! We're all still thrilled about it. This is the picture of the Apollo 11 crew. Yes. And you know the names of two of the people in this photo. You know the names of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the sides, but you have no idea the name of that guy in the middle. No, you don't. Clint might, but nobody else does. Nobody knows. Of course Clint knows. Nobody else knows the name of the middle guy in this picture. His name is Michael Collins. Wow, yes, now we know all three names. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins. You're never going to forget, again, that trivia night that you go to where they go, who's the third crew member of the Apollo 11 that nobody knows? You're going to go, Michael Collins. Yes, you are going to know. And you don't know his name because he didn't walk on the moon. Because guess what? When you've got three people flying a spaceship to the moon and two people get off the spaceship to walk on the moon, somebody's got to stay in the spaceship and make sure that baby is still flying. And so Michael Collins was just orbiting the moon while these two were just skipping along, gravity-free on the moon. Michael Collins is steering the ship, orbiting the moon. He orbited the moon 14 times while they were skipping around the moon. And for 30 minutes of each orbit, he went around the far side or the dark side of the moon, and because this huge rock was then between them and NASA, he had complete and total radio silence, non-communication for 30 minutes. Every single time he passed around that far side of the moon, totally and utterly by himself. NASA said that not since Adam, not me, Adam. Not since Adam has any human known solitude as Mike Collins is experiencing during this 47 or so minutes of each lunar revolution. Later, talking about the experience of what it was like to be in that place of total, unique, set apart, never before done isolation, Mike Collins said this: if account were taken in that moment, when he's on the far side of the moon, if account were taken, the score would be 3 billion people on Earth plus 2, the two skipping around on the moon, plus 2 over on the other side of the moon, and 1 plus God knows what on the other side. It's so interesting how in this situation, Michael Collins was put into a place where he had a unique experience, a unique perspective, where he was in such a solo, unique, set apart, never before done position. And as a result, he had a unique perspective where he felt in that moment the uniqueness of everybody else being on this side of the moon, of having this perspective, and him alone having this other perspective of being on the far side of the moon. It's so fascinating how powerful perspective is, and how powerful the way that we see things are based on the view that we have of a situation. Perspective can do so many different things. Perspective can unite. Perspective can isolate. Perspective can make us see. Perspective can obscure from view. And perspectives, the unique view that we have of a situation, is of incredible importance when we live in our lives. Because when we are in situations in our life where we're dealing with something of importance, or we're dealing with something of value, a relationship that we're in, a conflict that we're in our family, a societal pressing issue or question that we're asking, the perspective that we have on that thing is of remarkable importance and will in some ways determine what it is that we see when we look at that thing. And sometimes that is a enriching and a rewarding experience. Sometimes it puts us in relationship and community with other people who see like us, right? Like those 3 billion people who are all looking at the one side of the moon. Sometimes our perspective is incredibly alienating, lonely, isolating, or makes us feel isolated. Like we are that one person in the shadow of the moon, rotating around, seeing something that no one else sees, maybe that no one else cares to see. Where do we get our perspectives from? Why are they important? And can our perspectives ever change? Should our perspectives ever change? These are some of the questions that we're going to be looking at today. I've titled today's sermon, I Don't Want to Gain a New Perspective. We are looking in Jonah chapter 4, verses 5 to 11. We've been going through a sermon series, an expository sermon series, where we have just been walking through the book of Jonah verse by verse, and we've been looking at the question of maturity. How do we grow up in life? How do we grow up in faith? God help us. We don't just want to be spiritual infants for our entire lives. Some people are content to do that, fine, but we're not content to do that here. We want to grow, and we want to grow so that we can become more mature people. We want to grow so that we can become weight-bearing people who can carry things in our lives for ourselves, for other people. We want to be able to have a life that is about more than just myself, where we're giving out to other people. And so we've been looking at the question of maturity and spiritual maturity and how we grow up in the text of Jonah. And today we are looking at the fourth sort of section of not just what immaturity looks like, not how God can save us from immaturity, but the choices that we make that make us chronically immature. How do we choose chronic immaturity? Not just immaturity once, but immaturity again and again and again and again. How do we do that? We're looking at this question again today. Again, the title is I Don't Want to Gain a New Perspective. Jonah chapter 4, verses 5 to 11. I'll read the text aloud. I'd really encourage you, if you have a device or a Bible, to go there, flip something open, and engage with the scriptures yourself. Look at them with your own eyes and follow along as I read. Jonah went out of the city and sat to the east of the city and made a booth for himself there. He sat under it in the shade till he should see what would become of the city. Now the Lord God appointed a plant and made it come up over Jonah, that it might be a shade over his head to save him from his discomfort. So Jonah was exceedingly glad because of the plant. But when dawn came up the next day, God appointed a worm that attacked the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God appointed a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on the head of Jonah so that he was faint. And he asked that he might die, and said, "It is better for me to die than to live." But God said to Jonah, "Do you do well to be angry for the plant?" And he said, "Yes, I do well to be angry, angry enough to die." And the Lord said, "You pity the plants, for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night. Should I not pity Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle?" We're going to get to the last verse next week. So you can just laugh at the way the English renders that for now. Our perspectives determine what we see. Jonah chapter 4, verse 5 says this: Jonah went and sat east of the city. Jonah went out of the city and sat to the east of it. And when he did, he put enough distance between himself and the city for him to have a particular view of the city, to be able to look at the city all at once. Also, by going to the east of the city, he probably went up some significant elevation. So not only did he have a proper distance from the city, but he had proper elevation over the city to be able to see the whole city laid out in front of him. In other words, Jonah walked out to gain a certain perspective on the city, to be able to see it in a certain way. What is a perspective, and why does it matter? A perspective is what you see based on where you stand. A perspective is what you see based on where you stand. You know this. You go hiking upstate. You travel out west. You go up onto some observation deck in New York City, and you do that for a particular view of a thing. You know that thing is already there, but you don't care that it's already there. you're not going to see it so that you can gain knowledge about it being already there. You're going to see it so you can gain a particular perspective on that thing. A perspective from up high, a perspective from out in nature, some sort of a physical perspective where you see something in a certain way, and as a result, it shows you something based on where you stand. And the way that we do this in nature is a mirror and a sign of the way that we do this in our lives. Because we stand in a particular place in our lives, and as a result, it gives us a certain perspective on the things that we see. The family that you're born into is a place that you stand. And as a result, you see the world in a certain way, because your perspective is shaped by the family you stand in. Our cultural background, or place of societal belonging, is a place that we stand, and we see things in a certain way because we stand in that space and look at it from that space in a certain way. Our families, our societal background, our cultural background, just our certain predispositions. I happen to be wired to like this thing and not that thing. All of these things are places from which we stand that give us certain perspectives on the world. And there are so many benefits to having perspectives, to valuing perspectives, knowing that we don't just see something, but that we have a certain perspective on it helps us to validate who we are. It validates my personality and my personal story. It says, not just seeing that thing, but the way you see it is valuable. And that's such a validating thing to hear because it says yes to all of the things that make me me. Acknowledging perspectives and the value of perspective is so good because ideally it makes us better listeners. We don't just look at something and go, well, because I saw it, I've seen the whole thing. We go, wow, I looked at that thing and I saw this. But somebody else might be able to give me some richer perspective if I could listen to what they see. And so valuing perspectives ideally helps us be better listeners and care more about the unique insights that other people have to give. And so perspective is a wonderful and valuable thing oftentimes. Perspective, however, can also be a difficult and challenging and limiting thing. Because while oftentimes our perspectives are enriching, there are other times where our perspectives are inhibiting. Our particular perspective on something is narrow or limited or even outright obscured, such that our perspective on something is no longer helping us see something as it really is. And again, we can think about this in nature. You go hiking upstate and you are looking over some wonderful vista, and say there are 10 of you, and we ask each one of you what you're seeing, and 9 of you say, I'm looking out and I'm seeing this wonderful vista, and 1 of you says, I don't see anything. I see some strange, blurry, brown nothing. And we look at that person and go, you're standing directly behind a tree. We would not look at them and go, you've enriched our perspective. 9 of us have seen this, but you have seen that. Oh my goodness, now our perspective on the thing is richer. We would say, you're wrong. There is something there. Step out from behind the tree so that you can see the vista with everybody else. But sometimes our perspectives function this way. Rather than giving us some better, more enriched individual understanding or contribution, they block or limit or make more narrow the thing that we're actually trying to see. Another metaphor for understanding a perspective is thinking about the hypothetical orbit of an eyeball planet. You've never heard of eyeball planets. I hadn't either. But there is a hypothetical kind of a planet called an eyeball. Clint, you know what an eyeball planet is? 2 for 2? Okay. Nobody else is even 1 for 2. Eyeball planets, these are artist renderings. Okay, these are not real planets. They're artist renderings of hypothetically what an eyeball planet would look like. Scientists postulate, and there are some planets that scientists postulate might be eyeball planets. They are planets that are close enough to the orbit of their sun that they actually do not rotate on their axis. And as a result, the part of them that is facing the sun would be clear and warmed, but the backside that is to the back of the sun would be totally frozen, and would be frozen all around. These are 2 renderings of hypothetically what an eyeball planet would look like. And you can see right in the front of both of them is the part that would be warmed by its closeness and its uninhibited, unending staring at its star, right? That warmth that would come to it, right? And the water that would be there, these hypothetically terrestrial planets, they would be in the Goldilocks zone. They would be an Earth-like planet. But everything else around it, because it doesn't rotate, because it's facing away from the star, is frozen. And so it looks like an eyeball. And ideally, I did not plan on this, but wonderful, praise God, providentially, I put two right next to each other so you can look at them like a weird pair of eyes. As you're looking at it, imagine it right now. Look at these weird eyeballs. Eyeball planets, put them together. Wow, a pair of eyeball planets, of eyeball. I don't know, what do you say? And if you imagine, right, let's pretend that they're actually looking, right? This eyeball planet actually has optical function, and so it's seeing. Right? The perspective, the quality of the perspective of this planet as it orbits its star would be entirely dependent on how close or how far it is from its orbit, because the further back it is, the more scope, the larger scope of vision it would have, the more that would be in view, the further away it was. And also the quality of view would be about whether or not it's obstructed or not. If some astronomical event, an eclipse, something passes in front, it would be obscured. And we can think about our perspectives in this same way. Sometimes we have perspectives that, like this hypothetical planet orbiting around a star, are so close, the view is so narrow, or it's so obscured by things that are stock or moving, passing in front of us, that we are not able to see the things that we wish we could see. And the challenge here, the reason why this matters is because for things that matter in our lives, not seeing them clearly carries a shockingly high cost. I mean, think about the things in your life where it really matters if you're seeing clearly. Like an intimate relationship, like if there's relational health in that relationship. Like, are we treating each other well? Or when we're like in this toxic place of accusing each other over and over again of who's doing what wrong. Like, to be able to see those things clearly, to not have our perspective be warped by something that's blocking our view or by our own biases. The stakes are so high in moments of relational conflict that we're seeing clearly. Think about any pressing societal matter. I mean, our most entrenched challenging societal conflicts almost always come with various important perspectives at play. And to be looking at those things just orbiting in some narrow way around one perspective is almost for sure too small of a view to have to take on some large pressing societal issue. With things that are really important, the stakes are so high with respect to the quality of the perspective that we're bringing to the table. And when something of value is in front of us, to have a narrow or obscured perspective is frankly just devastating. Our perspectives determine what we see, but our perspective is limited. Our perspectives can be limited by two different kinds of things. The first kind of thing are by things external to us. And in that sense, the same things that give us the gift of our own individual perspective, those things can in turn become things that obscure our sight. So our family of origin is a wonderful place to stand in the world in many occasions. At times, however, our family of origin gives us certain perspectives that are narrow and obscured, and they need to grow and become clearer, but we're actually inhibited by the things that we've learned from that place and that time. But the time that we grow up in is another thing that can obscure our perspective, our societal occasion. All of these things are things external to us that can obscure our perspective. Sometimes we have just rank biases and prejudices that we've learned or that have been given to us, and those are things external to us that they can really, really mar our perspective. And so we have things that are outside of us that make it hard for us to see things the way that they really are. But there's good news with respect to external obstacles to gaining a better perspective. We can move, or we can move them. Sometimes there's some external thing blocking our view, and we can say, you know what, that thing is obscuring my view. I'm just going to and set that aside. I'm going to move that out of the way so that I can see more clearly. Or we can say, you know what, I can move myself. I can go, I'm seeing this from here, but I'm just going to take a big old step to the left. You're right. And I'm going to just see this totally differently because I moved, right? We can move ourselves. even if we're not able to move ourselves or move the external thing, we can still give other people the gift of saying, in a moment of perspectival conflict, of saying, I am not currently able to change my perspective on this, but I recognize that and acknowledge that to you, and I acknowledge that my perspective might be limited or narrow, and I'm aware of the way that my perspective is currently locked in. How healing would that be in places of conflict, relational conflict, cultural conflict, societal conflict, generational conflict, if people, even if they weren't able to change their perspective, were able to say humbly and full of character, I acknowledge that my perspective right now is maybe a rigid one. I might be hard to engage with right now because I'm only able to see this one way. And we're just all living in reality about that. I might learn later that I've been more one-sided about this than I think. I would be sorry about that in the future. How good would it be if we were even able to say that about our perspectives? And so there really is all sorts of hope and good news for thinking about the way we see the world when we're dealing with external obstacles to our perspective. But, there's always a but. There's a second kind of obstacle that inhibits the way we see things. And these are not external obstacles, they are internal obstacles. They are ways that in ourselves, consciously, willfully, sometimes unconsciously, we see things a certain way, and we are bound and determined to keep seeing them that way, no matter what other information or what other people or what other perspectives we come into contact with. Internal obstacles can also be limiting to our perspectives. And the real challenge here, because we all have all kinds of internal obstacles that keep us from widening and growing our perspective, the real challenge here is that so often with our internal obstacles, we don't want to change the way we see something. We see things in a certain way, we have a certain perspective, and we have stakes in continuing to see it that way. We are willfully remaining in the perspective that we have. This is where our perspectives can get really damaging. When we see things a certain way that do not correspond to reality, they do not correspond to the whole picture, we are not seeing rightly, but we don't care. We want to say things the way that we see them, and we will do whatever it takes to continue to see them in that way. And Jonah has such a perspective in our text today, and is guarding that perspective with the same defensiveness and self-righteousness that you and I do about the things and the perspectives that we have that we hold most dearly. The rest of verse 5 says this, right? Jonah went out of the city, sat east of the city. He made a booth for himself there. He sat under it till he could see what would become of the city. Jonah has taken his perspective east of the city, above the city, to gain a particular view of the city, to be able to see the city in its entirety from a distance. What is Jonah looking for if he's taken that perspective? What sort of thing is he hoping to see by taking that perspective on the city? Well, he's either going to see one of two things. He's going to see nothing, because there's very little about the specifics of the functions of a city that you can see from that distance. Or, if something terrible happens to the city on a mass scale, well, he's in the perfect spot to view that. Jonah has set himself in a particular perspective because he wants to see a certain thing happen to the city. Namely, some sort of large mass, God's still going to get them, even though they repented type event. He wants to see that. And so he has put himself in a place where that is what he will see, or nothing else. Not only has he set himself in that perspective, he set himself up to endure in that perspective. Because out away from the city, Jonah's on his own in some wilderness. And the Middle Eastern sun is baking down on that guy while he's out from the cool of the light stone that would have been built in the city to help the city stay cool. He's out by himself, and the sun is baking down on him. But he wants to endure in this perspective, to see the destruction of the city for as long as he can. And so he builds himself a shelter to shade himself from the sun, so that he can endure for as long as he is able in seeing things the way that he wants to see them. And we are all doing this all the time. You and I have perspectives. They're often our most flat, rigid, self-serving perspectives about that other person out there who's bad. Oh, I just don't like them. They're bad, and they got all these flaws. Like, you know what? People have all sorts of different sides to them and all sorts of different perspectives on who they are. And that one person that really rubs you the wrong way, you know what? That's probably just as much about you and who you are as it is about them and where they're weak. And if you were to listen to what other people find loving and desirable about that person, your perspective might grow. But you don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. None of us want to do that. And so we view that person the way that we want to see them, and we build ourselves a booth of whatever kind of self-justification we can to keep ourselves from the winds of change flowing into our perspective. We do this with societal issues. Again, our most pressing societal global conflicts of the day have multiple valid perspectives that are a part of them. Multiple pressing important perspectives. And when you and I grab one of those perspectives and go, well, I'm absolutely sure that this is dogmatically the right view, we just set ourselves in some entrenched place in that conflict, and we build ourselves a little booth to say, well, the people who view this differently from me, they're wrong, they're bad, they're evil. And that serves as a little justification for us to continue in the rigidity and one-sidedness of the way that we see things. We are doing this all the time to protect the things that we want to see about the world and the way that we want to see them. This is the fourth step that we're learning from these last two chapters of Jonah about chronic immaturity and how we come to choose to be chronically immature. We won't receive correction. We won't change. We won't check our feelings. We won't gain a new perspective. We won't be open to seeing something in a different way. And as long as our perspectives are stuck and entrenched and locked in, we basically have no hope of doing anything else in our lives differently. Everyone is invested in maintaining their own perspective in societal issues and family conflicts and personal fights. And in this, we, like these little eyeball planets, are just orbiting in a tight, narrow, selfish, locked-in orbit that only brings the things into view that I want to see. And the nature of that orbit and the size of that orbit and the speed of that orbit is tailor-made by you and by me to keep us seeing things the way that we want to see them. The problem with this is, it's obviously insane. Nothing in our life, or in our families, or in our society, or in our culture, or in our political systems, are going to get any better as long as everyone does this. It's devastating. There's nothing of value that you are going through right now or that you care about right now that is served by your narrow, myopic, self-centered orbit around that thing. It's absolute madness. So why do we keep doing it? And there may be a number of answers to this question, why, that get at all sorts of different parts of human nature. But I think one reason why we persist in this way of seeing these things is that our most narrow and rigid and closed-minded orbits around certain things are, at the end of the day, protecting something. They're protecting something that's even deeper than the way we see that relationship or that situation. They're protecting ourselves. They're protecting our view of ourselves. At the end of the day, every rigid orbit that we have around something is guarding an orbit that I have around me. I'm orbiting around myself, and I'm orbiting around my sense of myself. I'm orbiting around the guilt and the shame that I'm hiding from and dealing with that would be exposed if I were proved to be wrong about that thing over there. We're hiding and protecting our view of ourselves through all of these other things. Our limited perspectives protect us from having us to see ourselves. Our limited perspectives protect us from having to see me and who I really am. It's this wonderful object lesson that God puts Jonah through here at the end of the book, especially in verses 6 through 9. God appoints a plant, and Jonah is exceedingly glad about the plant. It's so funny because Jonah was exceedingly displeased that Nineveh was saved, and he's just as glad in the opposite direction. His emotion is just as strong. He's exceedingly glad and joyful and pleased that he has a plant to come and give him shade from the sun. But God appoints a worm, and the worm attacks the plant, and then God appoints a wind and a wisp, and now Jonah is full of discomfort. And God asks him, are you angry? And he says, yes, I'm angry. I'm so angry, I would rather not be alive than have this plant be taken from me. I'd rather not live. I don't want to live in a world where this thing that was giving me comfort is gone. You know, what kind of people get this upset about something this insignificant? You know, the answer to that is people who are tiny, small, clutching, self-centered little gremlins. Now, a little more charitably, that's my frank, challenging interpretation. A little more charitably, people whose lives and self-understanding are so impoverished with respect to their feeling of being loved and lovable, their feeling that their life has good and gracious gifts coming for them, people whose lives are so empty on love and grace and the sense of self, the sense of confidence, the sense of I'm valuable that comes from those things, that we clutch and grasp onto the smallest, most insignificant little things. Those kinds of people get this upset about something this small and insignificant and passing. This is why Jonah is angry about the plants. It's why he can't find it in himself to be merciful towards the Ninevites. Jonah has a loveless, graceless, blessingless view of me. And because he's not working from a place of fullness about any of those things, he just can't handle watching something good happen to somebody else while something impossibly small is taken away from him. God, we're like that. We are. Looking around going, why did all those other people get all those things? And then the small thing, we're not able to be gracious. We're not able to be charitable. We're not able to be merciful. We have nothing to give even in the small things because as people, God, we're just empty. We do become small. We do become clutching. We become the worst bound up version of the person, of the great goodness and form of the person that God put it in you to be. So when God comes to Jonah and uses the same logic, uses his own affirmation about his need for the plant, when God comes to him and uses that same thing that he has just affirmed to show him his own perspective, to use Jonah's own affirmation to show him how right God is to be concerned about the Ninevites. Right? Because Jonah was concerned about the plants, even though he didn't plant the plant, he didn't labor for the plants. But God implicitly is saying, I labored for these people. I'm the maker of these people. Should I not? You were concerned about something that you didn't labor for. You were concerned about something that you had no business in bringing about. Should I not be concerned about a city that's full of life that I helped to bring about? Jonah can't even answer him. Because to answer God and affirm God's perspective would be to admit that his perspective is wrong. And in that moment of admitting that his perspective is wrong, he would also be admitting who he actually is. I am the sort of person who has such small character and who feels so little love coming into his life that I would think in such a narrow-minded, uncharitable way towards another group of people. So Jonah can't even reply to God about it, because to do so would be to admit that God is right and he is wrong, and it would be to expose who Jonah is right now as a person. In the same way, there are really high stakes for us when we are encountering some other perspective, because sometimes we encounter another way of viewing things that is saying to us, your perspective is maybe wrong or limited or narrow, and that reveals something about who you are that you are protecting, that you're guarding. And we're just not willing to do that. And so we stay entrenched in our small, tiny little orbits that are, at the end of the day, protecting my small, tiny little orbit around me. And we just spin around that over and over and over and over again. But see, the thing about that is that these little orbits that we have around ourselves, that really at the end of the day, almost always are protecting things about ourselves that we don't like. Things where we feel hurt, or where we feel lack, or where we feel lost, or elements in our character that we look at and go, that's gross, that's ugly, I wish I weren't like that, I wish I didn't do that. And so we keep spinning in this orbit of self-protection. Those things that we see, our own perspective on ourselves, is not the full perspective on ourselves. That's the wild thing about all this. When we are guarding ourselves and our own self-perception through our own rigid ways of viewing the world, we don't even have the full picture on me. But God, there's a God in heaven who has the full picture on you. God has the full picture already on who you are, on who you were, on who you are, and who you're going to be. And for all our fear about what the verdict will be on us, based on our own self-perception, God already has seen the whole picture of you, and he sees somebody that is lovable. He sees somebody that is worthy of grace. He sees somebody who's deserving and would be healed by mercy. He sees somebody who brings him delight. There's already a God who sees the full picture on you, and the perspective is at times more harsh and more honest than you're willing to see, but the whole story is far more good and loving and gracious than you can possibly see when you're just staring at yourself by yourself. God already has the full picture, and it's a way better picture than you think it is. The wild thing about our view of ourselves, this view that we're running from, or this view that we're protecting, that's at times impossibly better than it really is. These views of ourselves, these self-perceptions that we protect, there's already someone who has the full picture of you. And they look at you and they say, I made you well. You're good. You're good, and I love you. Now, when we think about that, we think, well, gosh, if that's true, how do I come into more alignment with a better view of myself? Because if I had a more loving view of myself, if I had a more grace-filled view of myself, if I had a more merciful outlook towards myself, maybe all my other perspectives would get more loving and more gracious and more merciful, and everyone in my life would be blessed by the widening of the perspective that I'm able to bring to the table. If that's all true, how do we grow in our ability to see ourselves more of the way that God does? How do we get that? And at first, we often think to ourselves, well, I'm going to go for incremental change. I'm going to just little by little try to believe more and more every day the way that God sees me versus the way that I see myself. And that's a helpful thing to do. There are benefits in that. There's wisdom to that. Like everything in our lives, there's wisdom to incremental change. But the problem with all incremental change philosophies is that they rely entirely on your willpower to get them done. You need something else that's born of faith that brings its own power in your life to see yourself differently. And the reality is that when you believe that there's a God in heaven who knows you already, who has the full picture already, even when you don't, that becomes power to begin to see yourself differently. This is what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 12. He says this, now about knowledge and how we come to gain new knowledge. Now I know in part, Then I shall know fully, even as I have already been fully known. We grow in all knowledge, but in right knowledge of ourselves when we first just accept that God fully knows me and he loves me. When we believe that there's somebody who knows us fully already and he loves us, that is the first thing that brings us power to see ourselves differently. Then, in a grace-filled way, through the rest of our life, our knowledge catches up to that. Even as I have already been fully known, my partial knowledge will over time become full knowledge. But there's no way there. There's no way there unless you first come to the place of saying, God, you know me fully already, and I love being known by you because you tell me the truth, and you correct me, and you grow me, and you're gentle and loving and gracious with me along the way. Once that gets in, then you go, well, God, I want my knowledge to catch up to that because it's gracious and merciful and good for me. When we believe that God knows us fully already and loves us anyways, that is the first step to being able to want, especially in the hard things. Because nobody, God help us, nobody would have the courage to face the hard things about ourselves if we didn't know that someone was going to be gracious to us on the other side. And this becomes power to look at the whole breadth and scope of ourselves. Within that, then, believing that God already sees the whole picture and loves us anyways, God calls us to begin to see ourselves the way he sees us by orbiting around a certain thing, by orbiting around a certain person, by orbiting around God in a certain way, because the quality of our perspective is always determined by the quality of our orbit. And the God of heaven and earth, because he's kind, and because he loves you, and because he wants you to be looking in the world for signs of his life and in his presence, signs of his presence, signs of his life, signs of his attempts to communicate to you and reach out to you, has put into the physical makeup of this world a sign so clear, so obvious, so bright, that none of us could help foreseeing it unless we were seeing it every single day. The sign is this, that when the earth is full and good and running on its lines as it circles around that sky-bound burning flame, that you and all of your perspectives become to come into view when you look at the Son of God and orbit around the Son of God and call upon his name. All of our perspectives begin to come into view when we begin to orbit around Jesus. All of them. When we orbit around God's Son, we are at the perfect distance and at the perfect view to see in the right way and at the right time everything that we need to see. Not just in life's major orbits, because when we come to orbit around God's Son, everything does begin to come into view. Myself, other people, creation, the world, where it's all going, my neighbor, my friend, my enemy, all of that comes into view. But maybe most importantly for many of us, in the smaller, mini orbits of our life, like the orbit of a marriage. When all the things that can go on in a marriage are going on, all the challenges and the joys and the highs and the lows, when we say, I'm not just orbiting around Jesus in the big things of my life, but in the specificity of this relationship, we orbit around Jesus and we say, Jesus believes in marriage, and so I believe in my marriage, because Jesus does. When we look at our work and we feel despondent and broken down and like there's no sense of worth coming out of my work, we say, what would Jesus have to say about this if I brought him into the orbit of my work? And we remember, God gave me talents. Jesus believes that God has given us talents and gifts, and he says that we should feel full of confidence in those things and invest them and get to work in them. When we look at any number of smaller orbits that we have in our lives, beginning to orbit around Jesus puts all of them into perspective. Even some of the most challenging and most painful ones, like, why have I not gotten the things in the flesh in this physical life that I wanted? And in the mystery and sometimes pain of asking that question, when we orbit around Jesus in that question, we go, Jesus' life was full of physical lack. And he is the most alive person to have ever lived. If you want to grow up, you need to orbit around God's Son. Not just in a sort of a once and for all way in life, but with specificity about the specific things in your life that you are going through right now. If we can't do that second part, we're doing this weird, fake religious thing where we're like, I go to church, or I'm a Christian because I grew up that way, or something strange, but we're like, but I don't want to orbit around Jesus in every area of my life. I don't want his light to shine on every area of my life. And when we do this, we're like Jonah, who is like, I need to shade myself from the sun. Some of us are doing that. We're shading ourselves from the sun. Like, I don't want the sun to shine on me. If you don't want the sun to shine on you, you've probably put yourself in a place where you don't want to be seen. We need to allow, especially in the specificity of every single small, specific area of our life, to say, do I want the light of Jesus to shine on me or not? And when we say yes, we begin to grow up. If you want to grow up, you should believe in Jesus and begin to orbit around him in your life, not just in the big things, but in the small, specific things. And when you do, God puts you into the right distance with God's perspective on you, and your view of yourself begins to change and grow. Your view of the people begins to change and grow. Your view of the world begins to change and grow. And we bless ourselves and everyone else in the world with a perspective that is growing and gracious and honest and humble and charitable and all the things that the world needs to be able to see. Amen.